Hidden History Files. The ferry that tilted slowly. That morning, the sea off the southern coast of Korea was calm. It was April 16, 2014. A passenger ferry was traveling from Incheon to Jeju Island. There were 476 people on board. Among them were nearly 250 high school students. They were unpacking bags in their cabins. They were taking photos on their phones. They were sending messages home. For many of them, it was their first trip to Jeju Island. The night before, they had waved goodbye to their parents at the door. The ship did not hit anything. It did not sail into a storm. It simply began to lean, slowly, quietly, steadily. And then it kept leaning. More than a decade later, this disaster is still seen as one of the most preventable maritime tragedies in modern history. And the question it left behind has never fully gone away. Not because the cause is unknown, but because the answer is very hard to live with. The radar was working. Life vests were stored beneath the passenger seats. Lifeboats were secured on the upper deck. All the equipment required by regulation was there. Everything was present on paper. And yet, in waters not far from the Korean coast, 304 people did not come back. That happened over the course of about 2 hours. What makes this case different from many other maritime disasters is not only the sinking itself, it is everything that happened before it, and everything that failed to happen during it. The passengers were told to stay in their cabins. They obeyed. The ship kept leaning, but the order to evacuate never came clearly, and it did not come in time. Experts later said that such an order could have saved many lives. That is the question at the center of this story. Not only how the ferry sank, but why people inside were still waiting for permission to leave, while the ship was still above water. It was already tilting badly, but it was not gone yet. And there is one more detail that makes this case hard to set aside. When investigators began their work, they did not find one single catastrophic failure. Instead, they found a long chain of decisions. Quiet decisions. Small decisions. Each one may have seemed manageable on its own, but together, they had been building toward this morning for years. This ship did not become dangerous on April 16. It had been moving in that direction for a long time. To understand that morning, we need to go back a little further. The ferry was not a new ship. It was built in Japan in 1994. It was purchased second-hand in 2012. After the purchase, the vessel was heavily modified to increase awning capacity. More passenger decks were added. More cargo space was added. That meant the ship could carry more people. It could carry more freight, and it could make more money on each trip. But there was a serious problem. When weight is added to the upper part of a ship, the center of gravity rises. That means the ship becomes less stable in the water. It is more likely to lean when pushed, and once it starts leaning, it is less likely to return to an upright position on its own. Think of a glass that is wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. Even a small push can tip it over. To help prevent that, ships carry ballast water, that is seawater stored in the lower parts of the hull, to pull weight downward and help keep the vessel balanced. But investigators later found something important. On the morning of April 16, the ferry was carrying far less ballast water than its own regulations required. The cargo loaded that day also exceeded the certified limit, and that cargo had not been properly secured. The danger was not created that morning. It had been built up over time, layer by layer, decision by decision. Operational choices had slowly put capacity. Their conclusion was clear. The same turn, made in the same way, on a properly loaded ship, most likely would not have caused a catastrophic tilt and schedule ahead of safety margin. Let us pause here for a moment. After the disaster, experts ran simulations. A simulation is a test done with models and data to see what likely happened. They asked what would have happened if the ferry had been operating within normal safety limits. That means proper ballast levels, cargo within the allowed limits, and cargo secured the right way. That morning began without drama. The students settled in. They talked with friends. They watched the sea through the windows. The sky was clear. The water was calm. No one on board had any reason to think this crossing was different from the many crossings before it. But what they could not see was this. The ship beneath their feet had already crossed the line. At 8:49 in the morning, the ferry made a sharp turn. On a ship with normal stability, that would have been routine. But on this vessel, the shifting force caused the unsecured cargo to slide hard to one side of the hull. The ship began
선체
to lean.
전체의 3D
At
회전으로
first, only a
설계를
little.
입체적
Some passengers
Everyone,
may
please
not
pay
have
attention.
noticed.
I'll demonstrate
Others
how to
may
put
have
on your life
assumed
vest.
it was
Pull
ordinary
the straps
movement.
tight like this, then
By
pull the tab to inflate it.
8:52, the angle
Now,
had
please
become
put on your
severe.
vests.
Objects were sliding across cabin floors.
Everyone, please.
Passengers were being pushed against the walls. It was clear that something was wrong. Then the intercom came on. The voice was calm. It was steady. Passengers
Everyone,
were
please
told
pay
not to
attention.
leave
I'll
where they
demonstrate
were.
how to put on
They
your
were told
life
to
vest.
stay in place
Pull the
and wait
straps
for
tight
further
like this, then pull the
instructions.
tab to
The
inflate it.
message repeated.
Now,
It
please
kept
put on your
repeating.
vests.
The students stayed. The teachers stayed. The passengers stayed. They trusted that the people in charge knew what they were doing. At 9:07, the first distress call reached the Coast Guard. That call was made
have
by
the
a student
location.
on
It's
board.
confirmed.
A teenager picked up a phone and called
On my
emergency services from inside the tilting cabin. At 9:30, the first rescue vessel arrived at the scene.
I have the-
The ferry was still above water. It was badly tilted. It was leaning at a severe angle, but it was still floating, and many people were still alive inside. This is the window of time investigators examined most closely in the years that followed. From the moment the ship began to tilt to the moment it disappeared below the surface, nearly 1 hour passed. Later analysis reached an important conclusion. If a clear evacuation order had been given within that window, many passengers likely would have had enough time to reach the upper deck and enter the water. Some estimates suggested that just 8 minutes of coordinated movement might have been enough, but that order was never given clearly. Not by the captain, not by the crew over the intercom, and not by coordination centers on shore. Instead, the announcements that did come told people to stay where they were and wait. At 10:17, the ferry capsized completely. 304 people did not come back. What happened next was broadcast live across the country for hours. Rescue vessels moved across the dark water. Divers went into the sea and came back up. Cameras stayed fixed on the place where the ship had been. At a nearby port, families stood holding photographs. They pressed phones to their ears. They waited for any news at all. For many of those parents, their children had left for a school trip the morning before. They had waved goodbye at the front door. In the early stage of the rescue, the government announced that 370 survivors had been brought to safety. For a brief moment, something close to relief passed through the crowds waiting at the port. Somewhere, someone stopped crying. But 2 hours later, the number was corrected. The real number was less than half. That correction did more than revise a statistic. It broke something that had barely been holding together. Trust in the information being given. Trust in the agencies responsible. Trust in the system that it assured everyone that the situation was being managed. The command structure on the ground was in disorder. Information from the scene and from the coordination center did not match. Questions about those early rescue hours continued for years. People kept asking what happened then and what was lost in that time. Then, one more detail emerged. For many, it was the most painful one of all. While the intercom was still telling passengers to stay in their cabins and wait, the captain and several senior crew members had already left the ship. In the months and years that followed, investigators and courts reviewed an enormous amount of evidence. They examined testimony. They reviewed documents. They worked through the record piece by piece. The official conclusion was this: the ferry sank because of multiple failures that compounded or stacked up, one on top of another. The ship's modifications had weakened its stability. The cargo was excessive. It was not properly secured. The ballast water was critically insufficient, and a timely evacuation order was never given. Early theories about mechanical failure or an underwater collision were carefully examined. In the end, those theories were set aside. The evidence pointed in a different direction: cost-cutting, weak oversight, and a working culture in which schedules and revenue had come to matter more than safety requirements. Those conditions had been building for years before April 16th. There is one detail from the investigation worth pausing on. 2 days before the final voyage, the operating company submitted a written safety improvement report to port authorities. The report said corrective actions had been completed, but investigators found that those actions had not actually been carried out. A responsible official signed the form, and the ship was cleared to depart. Later, it became clear that inspections in the industry had often become little more than paperwork. Forms were filled out. Signatures were collected. Boxes were checked. But the real condition of the ship could be something else entirely. And this pattern was not limited to one vessel. Later reporting and audit findings showed that the wider sector had lived with this problem for years. The captain and several crew members were convicted and sentenced.
Company executives and regulatory officials also faced legal consequences.
But for many of the families, the criminal cases did not fully answer the question that mattered most. The question was not only who should be punished. It was how a system can allow this kind of risk to grow year after year without anyone stopping it. In the years after the disaster, South Korea made major changes to maritime safety systems. Older ferry vessels were phased out more aggressively. Rules for cargo loading was strengthened. Standards for vessel stability were also strengthened, and those rules were enforced more actively. Rescue response and coordination procedures were revised. A new national disaster management structure was created. Emergency evacuation training for passenger vessel crews was overhauled. It was no longer supposed to exist only on paper. It was meant to involve real practice. Many of the things passengers now expect on Korean ferries came into their present form because of what failed on April 16, 2014. Clearer safety briefings, stricter load limits, more meaningful inspections, better trained crews. These things feel routine now, but they were reshaped by that morning. Even the safety announcement you hear before departure matters in a different way when you know this history. The instructions about life vests, the guidance about emergency exits. Those messages were rewritten because the old system did not work when it needed to. And the lesson this disaster leaves behind goes beyond regulation. It goes beyond equipment too. When we step onto a shared vessel, a ferry, an aircraft, or a train, our safety does not depend only on whether the right equipment is present. It also depends on whether the conditions exist for that equipment to be used correctly. Overloaded schedules, financial pressure, inspection systems that check papers instead of reality. These are not loud failures. They are quiet failures. They build slowly, and they remain invisible until the morning a ship begins to lean. On April 16, 2014, a passenger ferry began to lean in the waters off the southern coast of Korea. The people inside waited for an instruction that did not come in time. Today, many safety standards on ferries and passenger vessels feel ordinary. Tighter stability rules, clearer evacuation procedures, more meaningful inspections. But many of those standards exist because of what failed that morning. What seems ordinary now was written in response to something that was not. And that leaves us with one question. How often do we trust that the system around us is working, without stopping to ask whether it truly is? We remember this disaster not to place the whole weight of tragedy on one person or one single moment. We remember it because the questions it raises do not disappear. And asking those questions is the only way we have any chance of making sure the next ship does not begin to lean.